We start too many shows in too many weeks talking about deadly shootings in this country, and here we go again. This time it happened at a mall food court in Indiana. This was last night.
Three people dead and injuring two others, including a 12-year-old girl.
At the Supreme Court today, an historic upheaval.
So, hello, Shannon. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Shannon is currently a junior at Suffolk University in Boston, and she is studying broadcast journalism with a minor in political science. She is currently an intern at Boston 25 News. And she is super passionate about social justice issues, especially those concerning women's reproductive rights, as well as gun control, which are both very hot topics right now in the United States. So I would love to start off just to hear a little bit about really like what got you interested in the subject and how you kind of started gaining knowledge on these various issues that are plaguing the country right now.
So for gun control, I grew up in U.S. public schools, and in the fourth grade, that was when the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened in Connecticut, and I'm in Massachusetts at that point, so it was pretty geographically close, and also the kids affected were around the same age as me, so I think that one was sort of when it started impacting me and realizing that a school shooting or a shooting could happen to me. It's happening here and it's pretty close. And then it wasn't really until I was a freshman in high school when I sort of got into the activism there, because another time I was freshman in high school at public school, and the Parkland shooting happened at a high school in Florida. And that was when I just really got angry because so many students lost their lives, and I was in the exact same situation as them. So I knew at that point it could have been me, and thankfully there was a lot of uprising there, and young people like myself were using their voices. So then I got involved with my school, and I was on the board to make a walkout protest for gun control, and attended protests in Boston for it, and just sort of got interested then because I realized that I was old enough now to have a voice and use that voice, and I couldn't stay silent anymore because next time it could be me or a loved one.
What exactly would you describe right now in time your personal stance is when it comes to how you view gun control in the United States?
Gun control in the United States is a complete mess, in my opinion. I think that so many different states have different laws regarding it. So if you live in a blue state like Massachusetts, it's really hard to get a gun, even if it's just a handgun. But if I went on vacation to Texas, it would be super easy and no background check would be run on me. And I think that's really scary. And just, I'm not a fan of how the states are sort of up to that power and how different it is just depending on what state you live in, because we're in the same country. And it's ridiculous that people can still buy military rifles that can shoot over 100 rounds in 2 minutes, because why would any civilian ever need 100 rounds in 2 minutes? That's absolutely ridiculous. And some people might say, oh, well, I need it for self-defense. There are handguns you can get, and I am not the biggest fan of those, but right now, I think that time after time in these shootings, we see assault style military grade weapons, and I think that those should not be allowed, and we need to ban those nationwide, not just in a few states.
How would you kind of like put the US when it comes to gun issues and gun control in comparison to other countries throughout the world?
I honestly get very disappointed because we have different examples of different nations who were faced with mass shootings and actually took action to ban assault style weapons. We have New Zealand, Australia, who had a shooting and the government did something. They banned the weapon that was used, and that has been very efficient since. Same in the UK, they have very little gun crime compared to us, and that's because of their laws that are in place partially. And I think that looking at those countries, it's easy to see that that could be a solution in the United States. It's just that, how do we get there?
What would you, right now in time, propose as concrete solutions to combating this issue?
I think that, like we talked about, we're not going to solve something overnight in this country because of how divided we are. So I think that we would have to make a compromise and perhaps not ban all assault style weapons, which is what I would want. But taking a first step there, I think a really great thing that would prevent a lot of these shootings is making it really hard to get that weapon or any gun. Making it as hard as it is to get a driver's license. If you want to legally drive on the road, you have to go through months of preparation and tests, and the government has all of that information. So I think that we need to make it, similar to that, where sure, people can still have their guns, because I don't think we're going to convince half of the American population to give up their guns. But you have to go through this really detailed process. And I think that that would help things that are sort of spur of the moment shootings, or also just flagging people who have mental illness and, oh, they shouldn't be able to have a gun, and actually not letting them have a gun, and sort of making that process strung out and really in depth.
So do you believe that mental illness, sort of like attention, is also something that we need to look at in order to find answers?
Mental health is definitely not the only reason why America has this problem, because people in every country in the world have mental health problems. But I think that that is a part of it, and also funding mental health resources, because someone who is struggling mentally shouldn't have to pay so much money to go get treatment. They shouldn't have to be left in the ER without a hospital room if they're in a crisis. I think that there's a lot of problems that we need to address there, but it's not just blaming mental health. It's also, we have to actively work to improve mental health.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. It was really, really like enlightening and interesting to hear your perspectives and how the US is really doing right now, especially in comparison with other places around the globe. Could you please tell me a little bit about what first sort of sparked your interest in women's reproductive rights / the entire abortion issue that's really occurring in the US right now, and how you've managed to really compile all this knowledge about it and go out and try to like raise awareness?
So for reproductive rights in America, it's something that I didn't realize till later. I would say probably I was in high school, and this is when a lot of red states began to implement different laws that were not completely banning abortion at the time, but they were limiting it. So, oh, you can only have one up until this date. You can only have one if this is the exception. So at that point, that's when the issue sort of went on my mind, because Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision, has been in place since 1973. So in Massachusetts and California, places that I've lived in blue states, it's something that I never really had to think about growing up until you sort of saw some states were trying to take away that right. And at the time, it's probably like 2018, 2019, it was like, oh, eventually they're probably going to want to ban all abortions. And so that's when it sort of was like, oh my gosh, this is real. This is probably happening because places are starting to do it. And although I am someone with a uterus, so I could be affected by this, and even though I am in a blue state, it's still scary because I shouldn't have to worry about other women and other people who can get pregnant, and I shouldn't have to worry that if I travel somewhere in my own country, if something happens, then I could literally lose my life in the process or be denied healthcare. So I think it's not just me personally worried about something happening to me. It's mainly knowing that just purely based off of where someone lives in this country, that their literal life could be up in the arms and their bodily autonomy can be taken away from them just because they live in a different state than I do. And that's all up by chance.
Could you give a little bit of context on Roe versus Wade? Because I know that's very unique to the United States. This big landmark court ruling. What exactly was the ruling, and why has it only kind of come back and been overturned now?
For context of Roe versus Wade, so back in 1973, this was a Supreme Court case. So if you're new to US government, Supreme Court, it consists of 9 judges, and basically they can have major say on federal law and what states can and can't do as well. So this case was 1973, and it basically said that the Constitution does protect the right to an abortion, which meant that the states that banned abortion and had limited abortion access had to get rid of those, and they needed to make it accessible because the court determined that it was a constitutional right. So now that it's overturned, what that means is the court, they took another case that was sort of questioning a abortion law in a state, and they, even though that case was, individual to the state's law, it determines the whole country basically and what states can and can't do. So now that the court has overruled Roe versus Wade, basically the 50 years that we've had of that being a constitutional right, abortion, is now they're saying, no, it's not a constitutional right and states can choose what they want to do. Since Roe was overturned, it is extremely divided and mainly depends on what state you live in. So we have seen a lot of blue states, California, New York, reaffirming that you can get an abortion here and you are protected, making those laws in further action to protect that right. But now it's up to the states. So it really depends on what state you live in. So we have those states that are blue who are protecting your right, and then states that are red are automatically sort of putting trigger laws if they hadn't already banned abortion. So that was, once Roe was overturned, they were like, basically it goes into effect within 30 days. So coming up soon, if not already, these states are going to have banned abortions. And on the individual side, I would say it's a really interesting thing to look at, because I would say that more women that I know are up in arms about it and very angry that Roe was overturned because it affects them more. But there are also a lot of men going to protest. But on the other side too, I would say mainly pro-life, probably the majority is male, but you have a mix of both genders and all identities on both sides. So it's a interesting divide that I would say is more by state, by religion, than it is by gender.
So with this new Roe versus Wade overturn that kind of caused an uprising really just a few weeks ago in this country, did that ban women who just simply travel but don't become permanent residents of a different state? Does that ban their right to access abortion and just during travel?
So for example, let's say I, from Massachusetts, go to Texas for a vacation. And let's say, regardless of how the situation is, I end up with an unwanted pregnancy. If I am in Texas and I want to get, Plan B or something like that, because they're starting to take away that too. I mean, it depends how long you're there, but in that state, just because you're from Massachusetts, you don't have that reproductive right. Now that you're in a different state that has, so like wherever you are, you have to sort of follow that rule. So could you travel back to the blue state? Yes, but it's sort of like maybe a better situation. Someone going to college from New York State to Texas again, if they're in college and they're in Texas for a few months and they try to go to a Planned Parenthood, something, no, you can't get an abortion. you'd have to go back home. If someone has the financial means to travel to a blue state or they have family there, it's going to be so much easier to have access to an abortion than someone without those financial means, because if you don't have the money to go out of state, then you're sort of stuck in the state that you're in. And so it's mainly going to impact women and people below the poverty line, which is primarily in these states, women of color and LGBTQ people. So I think that's a really important angle to look at, that people, it's not going to affect everyone the same, the ban.
So would you say that when it comes to the people that are making these decisions, do they reflect the population of the United States? Or is that where the issue lies, is the people that are making these decisions do not kind of give the voice to the people that are affected the most?
People in power, specifically the Supreme Court, is male dominated and mainly white. So that does not reflect the United States population, and certainly does not affect the people who are going to be affected by this, mainly being women and LGBTQ people with uteruses, and women of color. So it's really that issue of the people in power are never going to have to deal with this issue themselves. They took away a right that people have that they probably don't see as a personal issue because they can't get pregnant. So it's probably a larger thing to them and not personal, versus, sorry, cut the verses out. Aside from the Supreme Court, you're seeing this at a state level too. So in a lot of red states, there are more men and more white people in power, and those are the people who are overturning and banning abortions and want to target contraceptive too, versus blue states, which have a more diverse representation in state government. So you're seeing more women in power, more people of color in power in those states. So they have a bigger say that, reflects the population better than it does in these red states where it's white men making the majority of these decisions. Overwhelming majority of the state Senate and state houses are made up of white men, and they're not affected.
Similar to your ideas about proposing solutions for gun control and the way that we would change that in the United States, what would you say are some things that you think can be done now or could change kind of the trajectory that we're going into, if we wanted to look at relieving or alleviating some of the reproductive rights that are being taken away from women?
Since now it is up to the states for abortion being legal or illegal in that state, I think that it's super important to have representation in the government. So where does that start? That starts from voting. So it's not just telling people to vote, because a lot of these states that have white men in power are also known for voter suppression. So I think that's something that we can work on, which might seem, it's not directly abortion, but it's something that could definitely impact who's in charge and who's making those decisions. So for example, if you live in the state of Georgia and you had to wait 8 hours in line because you live in a mainly Black community to vote, you have to wait 8 hours in line, and they have laws saying that you can't leave to get food or water or anything in an 8-hour line or longer, depending on where you live. So it's really interesting because a lot of people think that, why is this happening? Because the US population largely protects Roe and agrees with Roe. Why is this happening? Because those people in those states being affected by this the most don't have a say. So I think that we need to really work at voting rights and helping people in those communities of color and those of lower income to be able to get to the ballot. And to do that, it does start in the government, but also people can individually help with that, especially if you live in an area and you have privilege. You can help provide people the necessities that they need to get out and vote, because when more people are able to vote, it's probably going to change. Because if these communities of color, these women of color, are able to vote in a normal voting line that would happen in a white community where you'd be in and out in 15 minutes instead of 10 hours. If they're able to vote easily, then they're going to vote more women and more people of color into power. And those people largely want to protect Roe.
By improving voter suppression in the United States, you will give a voice to those who typically wouldn't have or wouldn't have as much. But do you think that we can go back and change this with voting? Like, is voting still an option when it comes, or is it overturned and now we can't go back? Like, can we still get people together to vote and then like kind of overturn the overturn?
Yeah, so for the Supreme Court itself, so they are going to determine whether this is going to stay overturned or not. But since they did give the power to the states, that's where it's really going to come into play. So if red states get more women and more people of color into power, that might, influence the law there for abortion. So if it's really, we're not going to be able to change the Supreme Court overnight because they just made this ruling. So we'd have to wait until new people come onto the court, which, will happen once people die. And if it's blue versus red leaning, we're not going to really change that for many years to come, I would say. So I think it's more at the local level, and that's why local government is so important, even in a federal issue.
Thank you so much for all of this information and for sharing your personal beliefs as well as what you know about the issue and how we can really like take a stand and combat this, because it is so prevalent right now and there's a lot of turmoil and chaos and polarization that we're seeing in the US. So thank you so much again.
Yes, thank you for having me. Hopefully this educates some people who are new to US politics.